She came to his ranch starving and half frozen, but the cowboy's offer made her step back from the door. The lantern crashed against the wall as the little girl screamed, "Help him!" Outside, black river water slammed against broken wood while the cowboy disappeared beneath the current. Clara dropped to her knees in the snow, her numb fingers clawing for the rope as the wind tore through the canyon. Then she heard footsteps behind her and realized someone else had followed them to the river. If stories like this still pull at your heart, stay with us for the journey ahead. The winter of 1883 settled hard over the Bitterroot Mountains. Snow covered the wagon trails until fences and roads looked the same beneath the gray sky. The pines groaned under ice. Wind moved through the ravines with a sound like distant mourning. Clara Whitmore pulled her coat tighter as she climbed the last stretch of frozen trail toward Black Hollow Ranch. The hem of her skirt was stiff with ice. One boot had begun separating at the sole 2 miles back, and cold water soaked through each time her foot sank into snow. She kept walking anyway. The stage driver who left her at Miller's Fork that morning had not even looked her in the eye when he handed down her carpetbag. "Mercer Ranch sits north of the ridge," he had muttered. "If the wolves don't get you first." Then he snapped the reins and vanished into white wind. Clara had not eaten since the previous afternoon. Her stomach cramped so sharply. Now she pressed one hand against it while she walked. The smell of coal smoke drifting somewhere ahead almost brought tears to her eyes. Almost. She had buried too many things these past 14 months to waste tears on hunger. The silver mine explosion in Phillipsburg had taken her husband in less than a minute. One blast beneath the mountain, one collapse of timber and fire. By sundown, she was a widow with soot on her dress and nowhere left that still felt like home. Afterward, the mining town changed toward her slowly, then all at once. No more friendly nods. No more warm coffee passed across counters, just whispers. Bad luck. Death follows her. Colored widow. When the railroad cookhouse cut half its workers before winter, Clara's name disappeared first from the ledger. She reached the ridge just as the wind shifted. Below her, through blowing snow, sat Black Hollow Ranch. A long, weather-darkened house crouched against the hillside beside a crooked barn and 2 narrow horse pens. Smoke rose thin from the chimney. One lantern burned near the stable door, flickering weakly against the storm. The place looked tired, not abandoned, not alive either. Clara tightened her fingers around the handle of her carpetbag and started downhill. By the time she reached the porch steps, her hands had gone nearly numb. Snow clung to her lashes. The wooden boards creaked beneath her weight. For a moment, she simply stood there, breathing. Then she knocked. The sound disappeared into the storm. Nothing. She knocked again, harder this time. Inside came the scrape of a chair. Heavy footsteps crossed the floorboards. The door opened. A tall man filled the frame. Broad shoulders, dark coat, beard rough from several missed shaves. His gray eyes settled on her, without surprise, without warmth. Just caution worn thin by too many winters. Behind him drifted the smell of burnt coffee and firewood. "What do you want?" he asked. His voice sounded like gravel dragged across wood. Clara swallowed carefully. "I heard you might need help through winter." The man said nothing. Wind shoved snow across the porch between them. "I can cook," Clara continued. "Sue, keep books if needed. I worked rail kitchens before the freeze came." Still nothing. His gaze moved once over her torn gloves, her soaked skirt, the cracked leather of her boots. Then he shook his head slightly. "Don't need hired hands." The door began closing. "Please wait." The words escaped before pride could stop them. He paused. Clara hated the sound desperation gave a voice. She heard it now in her own. "I can work hard," she said quietly. "You won't regret taking me on." For a long moment, the only sound was the wind scraping ice against the porch railing. Then another figure appeared deeper inside the house. A little girl, maybe 7 years old, thin shoulders wrapped in an oversized wool blanket, dark hair tangled from sleep. She stopped near the hallway entrance and stared at Clara with wide, uncertain eyes before slowly moving closer to the man's side. One small hand gripped the back of his coat. The cowboy glanced down at her briefly. Something shifted across his face, then disappeared again. When he looked back at Clara, his expression had hardened into decision. "There's only one empty place in this house," he said. Clara frowned slightly, not understanding. The man rested one hand against the doorframe. "It belongs to a wife." The words struck harder than the cold. Heat rushed into Clara's face so fast it hurt. She straightened immediately. "I didn't come here for that. Wasn't asking for romance." His tone stayed flat, tired more than cruel. The little girl kept staring at Clara from behind him, silent as snowfall. Clara tightened her grip on the carpet bag. "Then why say it?" The cowboy looked past her toward the storm-dark trail. "County office already warned me once." His jaw flexed once before settling again. "Girl needs proper family under this roof, or they'll move her to Helena come spring." The child lowered her eyes at the word Helena, orphanage. Clara knew the sound of that fear. "I don't need a sweetheart," the man continued. "Need someone who stays. Someone respectable enough to stop the county from sniffing around." Clara almost laughed at that. Respectable. There was nothing respectable left about a starving widow standing half-frozen on a stranger's porch. Yet she looked at the little girl again and saw something familiar there. Not fear of strangers, fear of being left. The wind rose harder. Snow swept sideways through the yard. Somewhere near the barn, a horse kicked loudly against wood. Clara realized suddenly she could no longer feel two of her fingers. If she walked away now, there would be nowhere else before nightfall, maybe nowhere after that either. "What's her name?" Clara asked softly. The cowboy glanced down. "Lucy." The child looked up again when she heard it. Clara crouched slowly despite the ache in her knees. "Hello, Lucy." The girl said nothing, but she did not hide either. A loose strand of Clara's hair blew across her cheek. She pushed it back with stiff fingers and stood again. "What's yours?" she asked the man. "Rhett Mercer." Another silence settled over the porch. Finally, Clara nodded once. "All right," she said quietly. "Not agreement, not trust, only survival." Rhett stepped aside without another word. Warmth touched Clara's face the instant she crossed the doorway, though the house itself still felt cold somehow. Not from weather, from absence. The fire burned low. One chair sat near the stove with a folded child's blanket draped across the arm. Dust lined the shelves. A woman's touch had once lived here. Clara could feel it in the faded curtains and the cracked porcelain pitcher near the sink. Now only the ghost of it remained. Lucy stayed near the hallway while Clara removed her gloves slowly, fingers trembling from cold. Rhett shut the door behind them. The sound echoed through the house like something final. For the first time in months, Clara Whitmore stood inside a home again. Yet somehow Black Hollow Ranch felt less like shelter and more like walking into a grave that had not fully closed. The fire near the stove crackled low, barely strong enough to push back the mountain cold creeping through the walls. Clara stood just inside the doorway, while melted snow dripped from the hem of her skirt onto the floorboards. Rhett removed his gloves slowly and hung them beside the door. Every movement looked practiced, quiet, like a man who had spent too long living alone. "You can leave your things there," he said, nodding toward the far wall. Clara set down her carpetbag carefully. Lucy still stood halfway down the hall, wrapped in her blanket, staring with solemn dark eyes. The little girl held something against her chest. At first, Clara thought it was a doll. Then she saw carved wood, a small horse. One leg had been repaired with wire. Rhett noticed Clara looking. "That's Dusty," he said. Lucy tightened her grip immediately. Clara nodded once. "He looks well loved." The child blinked but said nothing. Rhett crossed toward the stove and poured coffee from a blackened pot. that had likely sat there since dawn. He filled only 2 cups before hesitating briefly. Then he reached for a third. Clara noticed that. Little things told truths words did not. She accepted the tin cup carefully when he handed it over. Heat spread painfully through her frozen fingers. The coffee tasted burnt. It was the best thing she had swallowed in 2 days. "You hungry?" Rhett asked. Clara almost laughed at the question. Instead, she only nodded once. He opened a cupboard and pulled down a plate with 2 cold biscuits wrapped in cloth. Lucy climbed quietly onto one of the kitchen chairs while Clara sat at the far end of the table. No one spoke while she ate. Wind rattled the windows. Somewhere outside came the hollow knock of loose barn metal striking in the storm. Clara slowed herself after the first few bites. Hunger made people careless. She had learned that years ago, working railroad camps. Across the table, Rhett watched the fire more than her. "You said you cooked for mining crews?" he asked finally. "Phillipsburg first, then rail camps north of Butte. You can handle large meals? I can make flour stretch farther than most folks think possible." Something, almost like approval, flickered across his face. Almost. Lucy slid off her chair suddenly and disappeared down the hallway without a sound. Rhett rubbed one hand across his jaw. "She doesn't speak much anymore." Clara lowered her cup slowly. He kept his eyes on the fire while he talked. Her parents died spring before last. Fever took both inside 1 week, he paused. After that, she mostly stopped talking altogether. The words settled heavily into the room. Clara looked toward the dark hallway where the child had vanished. Loss recognized loss. No explanation needed. Rhett stood abruptly. "I'll show you the room." He carried a kerosene lamp down the narrow hall. Clara followed quietly, her boots creaking against old wood. The ranch house looked larger inside than outside. 3 doors lined the hallway. One stood partly open with a child's small quilt hanging crooked over the bed frame. The second door remained shut, not simply closed, sealed somehow. Clara felt it immediately. Rhett stopped at the final room near the back wall and pushed open the door. Small, plain. A narrow bed beneath the window, wash basin cracked along one edge. One nail hammered beside the dresser for hanging coats, but it was warm and clean. "You can sleep here," he said. Clara stepped inside slowly. The blanket smelled faintly of cedar. Someone had aired the room recently. "You prepared this before tonight," she said softly. Rhett leaned one shoulder against the doorway. "County clerk rides through every few months checking on Lucy." He looked away briefly. Needed the house to appear settled. There it was again. Not romance, not kindness, survival. Still, he had prepared a room that mattered more than Clara wished to admit. Her gaze drifted once toward the closed door farther down the hallway. Rhett noticed immediately. "That room stays shut." His voice changed when he said it, harder now. Clara nodded without question. He turned to leave, then hesitated. "There's hot water in the kettle if you want to wash up before bed." Another small thing. After he disappeared down the hall, Clara sat carefully on the edge of the mattress. Springs groaned softly beneath her weight. Outside, the storm deepened over the mountains. She removed her boots slowly. Her stockings were damp nearly to the knees. The skin along her ankles had turned raw from cold rubbing leather. For a long while, she simply sat there listening. Floorboards creaked once somewhere down the hall. Then silence again. Finally, Clara rose and opened the small dresser drawer beside the bed. Inside lay a woman's hair ribbon, blue, folded neatly. She stared at it for several quiet seconds before closing the drawer again. The dead still lived inside this house. Not through ghosts, through untouched things. Later that night, Clara stepped quietly into the kitchen, searching for water. The fire had burned lower. Rhett sat alone at the table beneath the weak lantern light, a whiskey bottle near his elbow. He had not touched it yet. Snow tapped softly against the windows. He looked up when Clara entered. Neither spoke. Then from down the hallway came the faint sound of a child whimpering in sleep. Lucy. Rhett started to rise, but Clara moved first. She found the little girl tangled in blankets, breathing hard from whatever dream had followed her into the night. Dusty lay clutched tightly against her chest. Clara knelt beside the bed carefully. "It's all right," she whispered. "Not too close, not touching yet." Lucy's frightened eyes opened halfway. For one tense second, Clara thought the child might pull away. Instead, Lucy only stared at her through the darkness, breathing unevenly. Clara adjusted the fallen blanket higher around her shoulders. The child watched every movement. Then slowly, very slowly, Lucy held out the wooden horse. An offering, or maybe a question. Clara accepted it gently. The carved wood felt warm from the child's hands. "You take good care of him," Clara whispered. Lucy blinked once, then her eyes drifted shut again. When Clara looked up, Rhett stood silently in the doorway. Neither of them spoke, but something unreadable passed across his tired face as he watched the wooden horse resting carefully in Clara's hands. Then Rhett turned away first. "I'll bank the fire," he muttered. Clara looked down at Lucy sleeping beneath the patchwork quilt. The little girl's fingers had finally loosened from the blanket. Her breathing came soft and even now. Carefully, Clara set Dusty beside the pillow. She stayed there another moment, before pulling the quilt higher around Lucy's shoulders. Outside, the storm dragged itself through the mountains until dawn. Morning arrived gray and sharp with cold. Clara woke to the sound of an axe splitting wood somewhere beyond the barn. For a second she forgot where she was. Then the smell reached her. Coffee, smoke, old pine boards warming near a fire. She dressed quietly in the faded blue skirt she had folded beneath her coat the night before. The fabric still carried coal dust deep in the seams from the rail kitchens. When she stepped into the kitchen, the stove already glowed orange. Rhett stood near the counter, sharpening a skinning knife, with slow, steady pulls across a whetstone. He glanced up once when she entered, then back down at the blade. "There's hot water in the kettle." Clara nodded her thanks. The basin beside the stove held enough warm water to wash her face properly for the first time in days. Dirt and melted snow swirled together, cloudy gray. Lucy sat at the table watching silently, while Clara braided her damp hair back from her face. The little girl looked away quickly when caught staring. Clara pretended not to notice. She moved toward the cupboard instead. Sparse supplies filled the shelves. Half a sack of flour, beans, salt pork wrapped in paper, 1 jar of molasses, not much else. "You've been stretching winter stores too thin," Clara said quietly. Rhett slid the knife into its leather sheath. Snow came early. She opened another tin. Empty. Another. Nearly empty, too. "How far's the nearest supply run?" "Red Wolf. Half-day wagon if roads hold." Clara nodded once. "Then these shelves need better planning." The words slipped out before she thought about them. Rhett leaned one shoulder against the wall, watching her now. Not angry, just surprised someone else spoke, inside this house like they belonged there. Clara cleared her throat softly. "If I'm staying, you are staying." Simple words. Matter of fact. Still, something eased slightly inside her chest, hearing them. She tied on one of the aprons hanging beside the stove. The fabric was faded green with one pocket half torn loose, another woman's apron. Clara hesitated only a second before putting it on. The skillet hissed when she dropped bacon grease inside. Soon cornbread batter mixed beneath her spoon while coffee reheated beside it. Behind her came the faint scrape of chair legs. Lucy had moved closer, not close enough to touch, just closer. "You ever stir batter before?" Clara asked gently without turning. No answer. But after a long pause, small footsteps approached the counter. Clara handed her the wooden spoon. Lucy accepted it carefully. The girl stirred too fast at first, flour puffing over the edge of the bowl onto both their sleeves. For one terrible second, Clara worried the child might retreat again. Instead, Lucy froze. then looked down at the flower covering her own fingers. A tiny sound escaped her. Not quite laughter, but close. Clara smiled without making a fuss over it. Looks like the batter fought back. Lucy's mouth twitched once before disappearing again behind silence. Across the room, Rhett stood very still beside the stove. The smell of fresh cornbread filled the kitchen by noon. Warmth spread slowly through the house after that. Small things changed first. Clara shook dust from the curtains and hung them back straight. She swept dead ash from the hearth corners. She stitched the torn pocket on the green apron while snow drifted outside the windows. That afternoon she found Lucy in the barn. The child sat beside a small dun-colored horse near the back stall. Dusty lifted one weak leg awkwardly when Clara approached. The animal couldn't have been more than 2 years old. Its front hoof had healed crooked. Lucy's fingers rested against the horse's neck. "She favors that leg," Clara said softly. Lucy nodded once. Clara crouched beside the stall gate. "Mind if I look?" The girl hesitated, then slowly stepped aside. Dusty flinched when Clara touched the swollen joint, but not hard enough to pull away completely. "She's been standing too long in cold mud," Clara murmured. "Needs dry straw packed thicker under the hoof." Lucy watched every movement carefully. Clara glanced toward her. "You've been taking care of her alone?" Another tiny nod. "Well," Clara said softly, "looks to me like she trusts you." The child lowered her eyes quickly. Snow began falling again before evening. Rhett returned from repairing fence wire along the north ridge just after dark. His gloves were stiff with ice. One knuckle bled through cracked skin where frozen rope had torn it open. Clara noticed immediately when he removed the gloves near the stove. "That needs cleaning. I've had worse. Still needs cleaning." Rhett gave her a long look, then sat heavily at the table without arguing. Clara fetched hot water and the small tin of salve she carried in her carpet bag. The smell of camphor filled the air when she opened it. Rhett's hand rested rough and scarred beneath hers while she cleaned the split skin carefully. He barely flinched. But when her thumb brushed the center of his palm, something tightened briefly in his jaw. Lucy sat nearby, pretending to sew crooked stitches through scrap cloth while secretly watching both of them. "You always this stubborn?" Rhett asked quietly. Clara wrapped clean cloth around his hand. "Only when someone's bleeding on my kitchen floor." The words came naturally. "My kitchen." She realized it too late. For a second, neither moved. Then Rhett looked toward the stove fire instead of at her. Outside, wind swept across Black Hollow Ranch in long, lonely cries. Inside, the lantern light softened the hard edges of the room. Later that night, Clara woke thirsty and stepped quietly into the hallway. The house stood dark, except for dying firelight near the stove. She almost turned back toward her room, before noticing someone asleep in the chair beside the hearth. Lucy. The little girl had curled sideways beneath a blanket with Dusty tucked against her chest. One small boot hung half off her foot. Clara bent carefully and eased the blanket higher. Lucy stirred but did not wake. Then, without opening her eyes, the child shifted slightly and rested her head against Clara's arm. Just for a second, a tiny unconscious thing, still enough to stop Clara's breath. Across the room came the faint creak of floorboards. Rhett stood in the hallway shadows watching them. His whiskey bottle remained untouched on the shelf beside the door. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Lucy shifted in her sleep, her cheek brushing lightly against Clara's sleeve. The child sighed softly and settled deeper beneath the blanket. Clara eased herself free without waking her. When she looked up again, Rhett had already turned away. The floorboards creaked beneath his boots as he disappeared toward the back room. Outside, snow drifted steadily across Black Hollow Ranch. Inside, something had begun changing shape. By February, the storms grew meaner. Snow piled waist-deep along the north fence, and the creek behind the barn froze thick enough for coyotes to cross at night. Most mornings Rhett left before daylight to break ice from the horse troughs while Clara coaxed heat from the stubborn stove. The house no longer smelled only of smoke and cold wood. Now there was cornbread, coffee, soap drying beside the wash basin, Lucy's small mittens hanging near the fire. Life had started leaving fingerprints behind. One afternoon, Clara stood on a chair rehanging the curtain near the kitchen window when she heard wheels grinding through snow outside. A wagon. Rhett looked up immediately from the table where he'd been repairing harness straps. Nobody comes this far in winter unless they need something. He stepped outside without another word. Clara watched carefully through the thin curtain. A narrow freight wagon sat near the porch. The driver was bundled thick in buffalo hide, snow frosting his beard white. The man handed Rhett a folded paper. Even from inside, Clara saw Rhett's jaw tighten while reading it. When he came back through the door, cold air swept in behind him. "What is it?" Clara asked quietly. "County office." He tossed the paper beside the stove. Clara picked it up carefully. Notice of spring review, child welfare inspection. Official seal of Missoula County stamped crooked across the bottom. Lucy sat silently at the table, drawing faint circles in spilled flour with one finger. Clara looked toward Rhett. "They're still threatening to take her? They say a ranch ain't proper for raising a little girl alone." His voice stayed calm, but she noticed the way he pulled harder than necessary, tightening a leather strap between his hands. "They've been waiting for me to fail since my brother died." The room fell quiet, except for the stove ticking softly with heat. Then Lucy suddenly slid down from her chair and disappeared toward the barn. Rhett exhaled slowly. She heard enough. Clara folded the notice neatly again. "I'll check on her." The barn smelled of hay, leather, and cold animal breath. Dusty stood near the back stall, chewing slowly, while Lucy brushed loose straw from the horse's crooked leg. The little girl kept her eyes lowered when Clara approached. "You worried they'll send you away?" Clara asked gently. Lucy's brushing slowed, then stopped. Clara leaned against the stall gate beside her. "I used to hate hearing grown folks whisper too. Usually meant trouble was coming." Lucy looked up then, only briefly. "But sometimes grown folks get scared too," Clara continued softly. "Especially when they love somebody." The child's fingers tightened around the brush handle. Outside came the muffled sound of an axe striking wood. Rhett, always working, always trying to hold the world together with his bare hands. Lucy suddenly held out the horsebrush toward Clara, an invitation this time. Together they worked quietly beside Dusty, while snow drifted through the barn slats in tiny white ribbons. That evening, Rhett returned from the shed carrying firewood against his chest. His coat sleeves were dusted white, and fresh blood marked one knuckle where the frozen logs had split skin again. Clara noticed immediately. "You keep tearing those hands open. They heal, not if you keep using them like hammers." Rhett set the wood beside the stove with a dull thud. Winter doesn't much care about comfort. Neither did he, apparently. Still, when Clara brought warm water after supper, he sat without protest while she cleaned the cuts. Lucy watched from the floor near the hearth, sewing crooked stitches into a scrap quilt, square Clara had given her earlier. The lantern light flickered softly across the room. "You always patch everybody up?" Rhett asked after a while. Clara wrapped fresh cloth around his hand carefully. "Somebody once did it for me." His eyes lifted then, not cold this time, just searching. "What happened to him?" he asked quietly. Clara understood immediately who he meant. She lowered her gaze to the bandage. "Mine explosion near Phillipsburg." Her voice stayed steady, though barely. They brought back his watch and one boot. Silence settled heavily between them. Rhett looked toward the fire. "I'm sorry," simple words, no pity in them, that somehow made them harder to hear. Lucy's sewing needle slipped suddenly, pricking her finger. She flinched sharply. Before Clara could move, Rhett crossed the room and crouched beside her. His large, rough hands looked almost clumsy, taking the child's tiny finger carefully. "It's all right, Lou." The nickname came soft, gentle. Clara watched something pass between them then. A grief too old for words now. Lucy leaned briefly against his shoulder while he wrapped the finger, with a strip of cloth, torn from his own hand, bandage. For a moment the three of them stayed close beside the fire. No one speaking. Wind pressed softly against the windows. Then from somewhere beyond the mountains came the distant, lonely howl of wolves crossing snow. Lucy moved instinctively nearer to Clara, and without thinking, Clara rested one hand lightly against the child's back. Across the room, Rhett noticed it. He said nothing. But later that night, after Lucy had gone to sleep, and the lamps burned low, Clara passed the shelf near the door and realized something quietly startling. The whiskey bottle was gone. She stopped beside the stove for a moment, staring at the empty space where it had sat every night since she arrived. The fire snapped softly behind the iron grate. From down the hallway came the slow creak of floorboards. Rhett. He crossed toward the back door, carrying a lantern and his heavy coat. Snow chains clinked faintly in his hand. "You heading out this late?" Clara asked quietly. "Need to check the north fence before the drift buries it. It's near midnight. Storm's easing." He paused while buttoning his coat. "Best time to move before fresh ice settles." Clara hesitated. Then she reached for the wool scarf hanging beside the door. "I'm coming." Rhett frowned slightly. "No need. I know how to carry lantern oil and untangle wire." A corner of his mouth moved almost like a smile before disappearing again. Outside, the mountain air sliced cold through layers of wool. Snow glittered blue beneath the moonlight, stretching across Black Hollow Ranch. The world felt enormous out there, silent. Only the crunch of boots and the distant snort of horses from the barn disturbed the night. Clara held the lantern while Rhett worked frozen wire loose from one leaning fence post. His gloved hands moved carefully despite the cold. "You don't sleep much," Clara said after a while. "Never learned how after Mary died." The name settled softly between them. First time he had spoken it aloud. Clara looked toward him but said nothing. Rhett kept his eyes on the fence wire. "House gets too quiet at night." The wind stirred snow across the field in pale ribbons. "My husband used to whistle while shaving," Clara said softly after a while. "Every morning. Drove me near crazy some days." Rhett glanced toward her then. "He stop after the mine work?" "No." A faint smile touched her mouth. Said if he stopped whistling, the mountain had already beaten him. Silence returned again. Not awkward this time, just shared. When they finally walked back toward the house, Clara noticed Rhett slowing his pace slightly whenever snow deepened ahead of her boots. Small things. Always small things. The next morning, the storm had cleared enough for travel. Rhett stood near the wagon, fastening leather straps, while Lucy tucked blankets around Dusty's feed sack in the back. "We'll make Red Wolf before noon if roads hold," he said. Clara tightened her gloves. "And if they don't, then we camp beside the river and curse winter properly." Lucy's shoulders shook slightly. A silent laugh. The wagon rolled down the frozen trail beneath tall pine shadows. Snowmelt dripped from branches whenever sunlight touched them. Clara sat beside Lucy, wrapped beneath one buffalo blanket while Rhett drove. Hours passed mostly quiet. Then Red Wolf appeared below them. A rough mountain town pressed between cliffs and timber yards. Smoke rose thick from chimneys. Men crossed muddy streets, carrying sacks of grain or split logs over their shoulders. Several heads turned when Rhett Mercer's wagon rolled in. More heads turned when they noticed Clara seated beside him. Whispers moved quickly through the cold air. Clara felt them without hearing every word. Rhett guided the horses toward the general store without reacting. Inside, warmth and kerosene smell wrapped around them. Shelves lined the walls with coffee tins, flour sacks, lamp oil, boots, dried apples, sewing needles. Lucy drifted immediately toward a small display of peppermint sticks near the counter. Clara reached for flour pricing tags hanging beside the sacks. "Need 20 pounds at least," she murmured. "Maybe beans too if the prices ain't foolish." Behind the counter, old Mr. Talbot scratched figures into his ledger book before finally looking up. His eyes landed on Clara, then shifted slowly toward Rhett. "You buying for the ranch now?" Talbot asked carefully. Rhett removed his gloves one finger at a time. "That's the plan." Talbot gave Clara another long look. Roads full of travelers this winter. The meaning beneath the words hung ugly in the air. Clara lowered her gaze toward the flour sacks. One of the men near the stove chuckled under his breath. Another muttered something she could not fully hear. Then boots scraped behind her. A ranch hand, smelling strongly of whiskey, stepped too close beside Clara's shoulder. "She ain't from around Bitterroot," he said lazily. "That your new housekeeper, Mercer?" Clara stiffened. Rhett did not, which somehow felt more dangerous. The man reached toward Clara's sleeve lightly, careless as if testing something. The sound came fast after that, wood cracking hard. The drunk stumbled backward against the saloon post beside the doorway after Rhett shoved him away with one violent movement. Nobody spoke. Even the stove seemed to go quiet. Rhett stood between Clara and the man now, shoulders broad and still. "Keep your hands to yourself," he said. Not loud. Worse than loud. The ranch hand rubbed his shoulder, muttering curses, but did not step forward again. Rhett turned calmly back toward the counter. 20 pounds flour, he said. "Coffee. Sugar, if there's any left." Talbot nodded too quickly. Clara remained frozen near the shelves. Her pulse hammered hard enough. She could feel it beneath her collar. Then Rhett looked toward her fully. Gray eyes steady. "Anything else, Mrs. Mercer?" The entire store fell silent. "Mrs. Mercer." The words spread through the room like fire catching dry grass. Lucy looked up first, then Clara. Heat rushed into her face so suddenly she could barely breathe. Rhett only waited calmly beside the counter, as though he had said something simple, obvious. Clara swallowed carefully before answering. "Needles," she said softly. "And lamp oil." Rhett nodded once. Behind them, whispers started again, quieter now. But none came close, not after what they had just seen. When they stepped back outside, snow had begun falling lightly once more over Red Wolf. Rhett loaded supplies into the wagon, while Clara stood beside Lucy near the hitch rail. "You didn't have to do that," Clara said finally. Rhett secured the final rope knot before answering. "Yes," he said quietly. "I did." Their eyes met only a second, still long enough to leave warmth behind even in mountain cold. On the ride home, Lucy slowly slid closer beneath the blanket until her small shoulder rested lightly against Clara's arm. And this time, she stayed there the entire way back to Black Hollow Ranch. The mountains around them were still buried in snow. The wind still carried that lonely winter sound through the pines. Nothing about the world outside had suddenly become easy. But inside that wagon, something had changed quietly. Maybe that's how healing really happens. Not all at once, not with grand speeches. Just a hand reaching for another hand in the cold, and finding someone still there. If you've ever lost someone, if you've ever sat in a silent house, wondering whether life still had room for warmth, then maybe you understand what Clara felt in that moment beside Rhett and Lucy. Sometimes the people who save us don't arrive with promises. Sometimes they arrive tired, hungry, carrying grief of their own. And somehow together, broken hearts begin teaching each other how to live again. That's what makes a family in places like Black Hollow Ranch. Not blood alone, not papers, not even the past, choice. The choice to stay when winter gets hard. Before you go, tell me down in the comments. Do you believe a person can truly find home again after losing everything? And if stories like this still mean something to you, There are more waiting down the trail ahead. More lonely ranches, wounded hearts, old secrets, and the kind of love that keeps a lantern burning through the darkest nights.